and I'm president of the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare. And one of our major foci is pressing social issues, addressing pressing social issues to foster solutions. So I want to welcome you to the second in our webinar series on systemic racism. Our board of directors decided to use an interview format for these webinars in which one expert interviews other experts on a topic that has to do with systemic racism. We hope that the format will make the discussion more spontaneous and thus better able to stimulate new ideas. We need new ideas. So today's episode is on systemic racism and poverty, and the next episode will be on systemic racism and homelessness. These episodes will be recorded for later viewing, and we very much welcome your feedback and ideas for future topics in this series. Thank you.
So I think it's also my turn to welcome all of our esteemed panelists, our participants that are approaching 200 people live on this particular episode. My name is Mary McKay. I have the privilege of being the Dean of the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and also a privileged board member of the Academy. So we are really happy to lend our electronic platform, we call it Open Classrooms, to be able to elevate this important discussion that we're going to have here today. We have just finished among our panelists talking about the responsibility that we have as university to be able to really shamelessly share our knowledge, you know, collaborate with others for true and meaningful social change. And so this is one of the ways in an emergency situation that we have here, that the Brown School stood up a platform to really democratize information and really partner with so many of you. So I'm happy to really be part of this. And boy, are our panelists horrific. And so I'm really excited to hear their discussion, and they have my utmost respect. So Shaun, as another board member of the Academy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, President Gellert and Dr. McKay. Welcome, everyone. I have the distinct honor of interviewing this illustrious panel of scholars on the topic of systemic racism and poverty today. My name is Shaun Eack. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work and Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh. It's really my honor to introduce our panel today and to lead them through fascinating and hopefully solution-focused discussion over the next hour. Our panel members today consist of an all-star group. We have first Dean and Professor Emeritus Larry E. Davis, who founded the University of Pittsburgh Center on Race and Social Problems and has dedicated his life to understanding and addressing issues of race in America and throughout the world. His contributions to the field in this area and so many others have been enormous and without parallel. And for that, he's received numerous recognitions, including the Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Council on Social Work Education, Society for Social Work Research, and recently the National Association of Social Workers. It's an honor to have him here, and we're so thankful to have my former dean here. Second, we have Constance and Martin Silver, Professor of Poverty Studies at the New York University Silver School of Social Work, Michael A. Lindsey, who is a leading child and adolescent mental health services researcher who focuses on addressing unmet mental health needs among African American and other vulnerable youth. Dr. Lindsey has received numerous awards and fellowships, many more than I could list today, but one that I thought was particularly relevant for this panel and this conversation was he was recently recognized for his work with the inaugural Larry E. Davis Award for Excellence in Research on Race from the University of Pittsburgh. Finally, we have Herbert S. Hadley, Professor of Social Welfare at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, Mark A. Rank, who is recognized as a foremost expert on issues of poverty, inequality, and social justice. His research on the life course risk of poverty has demonstrated for the first time that a majority of Americans will experience poverty at some point in their lives. His works received numerous recognitions and awards, and notably has been included and cited in speeches given by President Barack Obama on economic mobility. So how's that for dissemination and impact? Amazing.
He's my friend.
And so it's really my honor to be interviewing this panel today, and I hope everyone learns a lot about systemic racism and its contributions to poverty and income inequality in this country. Now I'd like to begin with our interview questions, and I do not have specific interview questions for specific panelists. Whatever panelists would like to respond to the question that is raised, please feel free to extemporaneously. This has not been scripted. So to begin briefly, to give the audience a better sense of how important this topic is, the issues of systemic racism and poverty, I wonder if the panel could describe for us some of the signs of racial inequality in wealth and income in America.
I'll start off.
Thank you, Michael.
So the bottom line is that racial wealth, the racial wealth gap is widening. Since 1988, white families saw their wealth grow by about $1,000 per year, while Latino family wealth grew by $66 a year, and Black families actually saw their wealth fall by $83 per year. This is per the Institute of Policy Studies. Also, the Brookings Institution reports that white families have nearly 10 times the net worth of Black families, a ratio that is higher today than at the start of the century. The Black-white wage gap is significantly wider in 2019 than at the start of the century, even as Latino workers have slightly narrowed that gap with white workers, according to research from the Economic Policy Institute. But the gap isn't a function of differences in education levels. Even among those who attain advanced degrees, Blacks were paid 82 cents per every dollar earned by their white peers. Latinos do better at 90 cents on the dollar, and the gender gap puts the gender pay gap puts the racial gap into a chasm unto itself. Black women on average earn 64 cents for every dollar a white man earns, according to another report from the Institute. I'll finish with this. Black families have long been behind their white peers in terms of home ownership, but that gap isn't the largest it has been in the half century, according to the Urban Institute. In 2018, about 72% of white households owned homes, compared to nearly 41% of Blacks, 47% of Latinos, and 59% of Asians, according to the Institute, using 2018 American Community Survey. So you see, there are many different instances in which the racial wealth gap is widening. I just highlighted a few, and I'm sure my esteemed colleagues are going to highlight even more.
Yeah, so let me let me jump in, and you know, everything that Michael's been pointing out is spot on. The one thing that I've been interested in is thinking about how inequality accumulates across the life course, particularly thinking here about the racial divide. And so, so let me just throw out a couple of things in terms of that. So if we look at the risk of poverty, say from age 25 to 75, for white Americans, 45% will experience poverty at some point during that period. But for Black Americans, it's 88%. So in other words, almost 9 out of 10 Black Americans at some point between 25 and 75 will experience a year of poverty. If we look at the other side and focus on affluence, how many folks actually hit a year of affluence? For white Americans, it's 54%, and for Black Americans, it's only 13%. So what I think is really interesting is to compare across the life course the odds of hitting poverty or affluence for whites versus Blacks. And what you see is that for white Americans, the odds are about 1 to 1. The chances of hitting a year of affluence versus hitting a year of poverty are about 1 to 1. For Black Americans, the odds start at 64 to 1 at age 25 that you're going to be in poverty versus affluence, and only get to 6 to 1 poverty versus affluence during the 50s and 60s in terms of people's ages. So when you look across the life course, you see this cumulative inequality building over time, which I think is really valuable because it's really important. The statistics that Michael points out about all of the income and wealth a lot of those are just point in time estimates. And this is kind of looking at how this develops across the life course.
Well, my colleagues, those facts I think are important. We know that it's basically 1 to 10 in terms of net wealth. And Blacks have earned about 0.6% of the income of whites for the last 5 decades. One of the things that, Michael, you mentioned to me that I think was important is something about housing, I think. And the work that Doug Massey has done has just been, I think, outstanding in this area. Where Doug Massey and Shanky, I think his name Shanky, we had him at the school, there's a video of him. But talking about how really that, Shanky in particular sort of argues that, you know, it's the segregation that most is responsible for the absence of mobility and social growth for Black people. You know, and I also like to focus on, you know, some of the less economic consequences, but it has all sorts of consequences. The home ownership thing is, you know, that's always been a case where we have, I'm not sure exactly what it is now because the pandemic wiped Blacks out so much, but we do know that it's an important, for example, one of the things that is found just kind of reading up for this stuff, that you guys probably already know that, but affluent people are 4 times more likely to vote, homeowners are 4 times more likely to vote than non-homeowners. Mm-hmm. So here, if you had this ratio, you have 70 to 20 or 40. And then not only that, there's another thing about looking at just the home ownership. The homes are less worth, they're worth less. You know, I always use the example, I'm from Saginaw, right? The neighborhood turnaround anyway. I actually gave my mother's home away. No equity at all. I don't know what she paid for it in the 50s, but when she passed in 2000 something or other, it was worth nothing. I gave it to Catholic Charities. And one of the most difficult things for Black families to do, it seems, I'm not sure, this is something I'm very interested in actually, is the intergenerational transfer of wealth. Mm-hmm. That for whatever reason, all sorts of reasons, they have difficulty passing on wealth to the next generation. We know that things don't translate as well. We know that the comment that Michael, you were making, that the education for Blacks doesn't equate to the same amount of income it does for whites with comparable education. So there's that's going on. In fact, one of the things about that, and in terms of segregation, the most affluent Blacks are more segregated from whites than are the poorest Asians or Hispanics. Blacks are really isolated. Now, this has all sorts of implications for human and social capital. For example, those of us who've been on, well, maybe not so much now, but when students apply, Black students apply to college, they often have preachers on it, Reverend so-and-so and so, you know, it's in part because they're reference poor. They don't know anybody. So the segregation keeps them from being in the loop. They don't, you know, so I know, Mark, you think about this a little bit, and it's kind of this, you know, this thing that's going on in the country. Do Blacks move out? Because it seemed like some of Shanky's stuff sort of says those who move out do better, but at the same time, all Blacks can't move out. I mean, you know, that's what. So it's really kind of a dilemma. But this, you know, and other things are going on now, you know, that cause great havoc for Black Americans. But I think I have a term I want to introduce today, if I might. Maybe I'll be quiet. I have a term I want to introduce. I can wait, but there's something I want to say it.
Please, Dean Davis.
Okay. I'm a big fan of the New York Times. Anyway, I was reading the New York Times, and they gave a case of this. Anybody, and this is accumulation of wealth. For example, there are only Of 22 million businesses in America, Blacks only have 4.3% of them, 4.3%. And we have to assume that they are, in candor, worth less than comparable white businesses. I mean, they have bigger clientele, whites do, and it's a different thing. But one of the things you notice in the Black community, and again, it's sort of like the piece I wrote for universities. Anybody who's been in the Black community, they are struck by how few Black businesses are owned by Black people. We have to be the only group of people in America that has more people from outside the group selling and doing business than people who are Black selling and doing business. It's just phenomenal. The piece that the New York Times did, what I call this, I refer to this as basically what they do. I lead into this with something called sharecropping. In fact, I call it phenomena urban sharecropping. That when Blacks came north, that they really didn't have the skills that were suitable for the north. So many of them did things, but they didn't open shops and do that. So other ethnic groups move into Black communities, hire Blacks to sell to primarily Black clients, but Blacks never own the business. And it's a phenomenon which I refer to as urban sharecropping, that they are there, they run the place, they help run the place, they translate for customers, but at the end of the day, they don't retain any capital, they don't build any wealth, they don't have any wealth to pass on to their children. Those of you who are not really aware of this, some of you are, I'm sure, go drive through a Black community, any Black community, Harlem, Chicago, you name it. You will be surprised how few Black businesses in the Black community are actually owned by Black people. So I thought I refer to this as urban sharecropping. That's the same idea that you never own the farm, you just work for those who own it, and another generation comes in, they help their kids go to college, but you don't have any wealth to pass on to your kids. I'll be quiet after that. I wanted to get across today.
This is a fantastic start to understanding just the depth and breadth of this issue for our country. As you hear Dr. Lindsey, we're moving in the wrong direction, not the right direction. Things are not getting better, they are getting worse. And that's obvious to many of us, but maybe not to all. 64 times more likely to have a period of affluency if you're white and less likely if you're Black. These are major disparities. How did this didn't happen by accident?
That's right.
How did we get here? Can we talk about history? What are some of the historical contributors that have produced what we're seeing today?
Well, for me, yeah, I'll start off. For me, there are a couple of things. And one, building on Larry's point, I wanted to share, I don't know if you can see it on my screen, this really powerful book by Mirza Baradaran, The Color of Money, Black Banks and the Racial Wealth Gap. One of the things that, and we had her at the McSilver Institute some years ago, one of the things that Mirza pointed out is that there has always been a financial stimulus for every community except for the Black community, particularly insofar as banking is concerned, right? She talks extensively about the Freedmen's Bureau and the promise of the Freedmen's Bureau for those who were recently freed coming out of slavery. And the fact that all of the gains financially that Blacks made coming out of slavery and going into home ownership were jettisoned by intention, let's be clear, by intention by President Andrew Johnson, who, as we know, assumed the presidency when Lincoln was assassinated. I mean, systematically deconstructed what the principal underlying stimulus was for Blacks who were coming out of slavery, right? And so what persists over time is this notion then that there's always been a financial plan for every community except for Blacks. The other issue that I'll point to is the separate and not equal education. Even beyond the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. Today, de facto segregation continues to doom Black and brown children in terms of underfunded schools, crowded schools, where they oftentimes get an inferior education. We can go on and talk about unequal discipline practices that fuels the school to prison pipeline. So for me, historically, those are two really critical issues that have continued to perpetuate the marginalization of Black and brown communities. But in this instance, we're talking about the things that have allowed to fester that continues to widen the racial wealth gap.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, if we look at the policies, the historic policies that the United States has had to try to build individuals' wealth. So if we look at the Homestead Act, if we look at the GI Bill, if we look at Social Security, Blacks have been left out of those programs. It's interesting to look at Social Security. It was designed not to include a major part of Black labor as an attempt to get Roosevelt to get it passed. So if we look at these policies, again, like the Homestead Act, which was designed to allow people to acquire some land, work on it, and then be able to have it. For African Americans, they've been left out of those policies over time. And I would say too, I think we're going to get to this in a bit, but what Michael was talking about in terms of education, one of the unique things in the United States is that we fund our education primarily through local tax dollars. And that has the effect of reproducing these inequalities because, as Larry pointed out, there's a huge amount of racial residential segregation in the United States, and you overlap that on top of incomes that are Black and brown tend to have less income. There's less of a tax base, and so the education that students are getting is of lesser quality than children who are in more affluent communities.
And families that have children are more segregated than those who don't. So you're having children, the social component of it, that they don't have contact with people who would benefit them. I mean, I have a story sometimes talk about a little bit about my own children going to school, but that's one of the dilemmas. That where do they go to school? Do you get, and for black people raising children, this is really an issue because. And this was the case with my own children. They may want to go to a school where they're in the majority, where their culture and people, their heroes, they like. But academically, that school isn't very good. So, but then again, do you send them to the other school, which, yeah, it's a good school, but it isn't very good for them. So the whole educating, this is a real dilemma. For Black parents, how do you do it, and how does it work? But the whole thing about the segregation really harms children because even again, I'm particularly taken with Sharkey's work, that Marcus kind of stuff you talk about again, that they can trace the deprivation that the kid has onto the next generation. It shows up again. I mean, you think. In some respect, you think, well, okay, I'm in poverty, I'll move out, and that'll be it. No, the argument is that you take it with you. You take this underprivileged conception of the world or things with you. So it's really a difficult. And as you mentioned, schools are segregated today. I mean, at the whole, and we are moving the wrong way. I mean, the whole effort now is to privatize schools, so they can basically take private money and pay private schools. They want to get rid of public education. So I don't see, if they have their way, this would really get increasingly worse.
Excellent discussion about really pressing issues that.
I want to say one more thing, Shaun. I think what's clear in all of our answers as a resonating theme is that the inequality that exists has been fueled by policy, federal policy. And so, I just think that's really interesting that we have not talked about this, prior to this conversation, the three of us, but we all arrive on the same conclusion, essentially, is that it's, federally infused.
This one of the things that this has done, I think, for social workers, and that I say this in something I wrote recently, that I was trained as a social worker and a psychologist to sort of believe that if people got together, they'd do better, they wouldn't have the racial conflict. And what social work has never had was enough focus on intentionality. That these things did not occur by accident. These things were structurally intended, and I think our students sort of just see them and think, oh, that's the way they are because maybe Blacks came from the South later or something, I don't know. But no, these things are by design. And the reason we haven't done that, that's kind of what the white supremacy does. The reason we haven't done that and the society doesn't want to deal with that, because it really does suggest that, they have been racist structurally, not just you have a poor character and that's the argument we always have with them.
Yeah, and I would, great point, Larry. And I would say, and also what Michael was raising about policy, if you look at urban planning policy, it's intended to sort of exacerbate these kinds of things we're talking about. So if you look at low-income housing policy, just zoning policy, all of these things are by clear intention. So, yeah.
Yeah. Our president said just in a tour, some speech he gave, rally someplace, he says that urban women should like him. He says, after all, I saved your communities. What he's talking about there is I kept your communities white. That's what he's talking about.
Wow.
That we didn't talk about when he said, otherwise you'll have communities of people, low-income people, you'll have Black people. It was code words, but that's what he's really talking about.
Such an incredible, important theme that you've identified, Michael. There are policy threads throughout all of this that have really driven this. We've already started on this conversation a little, but just for those who may not know, are all the policy threads just historical remnants from the past, or do we have serious contemporary policies that are helping to maintain these inequities?
Well, I would come back to the point I was making in terms of thinking about funding for schooling, and that is, here now, that has a huge effect on reproducing the inequalities that we're seeing. So I would point to that as a first one that's here and now today.
Something that Mark said in his response a few minutes ago resonates with me, and in preparation for this conversation, I came across something that is really interesting. So, racial equity has to be factored in our society for planning post-COVID, and that's very clear. But public works, infrastructure, transportation, real estate development are planned with regard to racial and economic inequities. And there's a need to redress those inequities. So I came across a recent article out of Carnegie Mellon. It's called The Methodological Framework and Feasibility Study to Assess Social Equity Impacts of the Built Environment by Samuel Jones and Daniel Armenias. I guess that's the correct pronunciation. But in this case study, they identify how social equity concerns should be factored into metrics that can be subsequently used by engineers who seek to make equity-informed infrastructure construction, replacement, and rehabilitation decisions. So for example, the building of bridges has been found to create inequalities, particularly where it concerns Black and brown communities, closing off their direct access to employment opportunities, particularly in downtown districts. The percentage of Latino, Black, and non-white populations are all negatively associated with the placement of non-restrictive bridges or any bridge construction. And these associations are consistent and robust. That's something we rarely talk about. Yet, these are contemporary, intentional, political, and policy-related decisions that inform our infrastructure development and clearly separates Black and brown communities from employment opportunities by the building of bridges. Very interesting.
Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that, the whole environmental justice movement has shown that Black and brown communities, low-income communities are much more likely to be affected by environmental pollution, toxic kinds of things. And that's just adds on to, Michael, what you're saying there.
Dean Davis, any other further thoughts on contemporary policies?
I think the ones they're referring to about the education one, and the education is not only. I had a conversation with Danforth when I watched you years ago, and his comment to me was, he says, it costs more than it does. It costs more to educate poor children. So even if the incomes were comparable, which they're not, more needs to go into that. It's the segregation itself that is really causing the problem. It's also think about social capital. They don't know anybody. People don't talk about this so much anymore, but people at one time used to worry if in fact African Americans were creating their own language, if they were so removed from the mainstream of society that they were becoming really different from society. So that's what I mean in terms of the school systems and all. That's absolutely. What is it now? It's some like. One of the things with the poverty thing, of course, is that what makes it different, when someone says this to us about, well, Blacks and whites are poor, and Mark, this is really your stuff. Whites who are poor don't live in neighborhoods that are as poor of Blacks who are poor. 30% of Blacks who are poor, 30% of their neighbors are poor. Poor Blacks, 30% of their neighbors are poor. But I figured for whites, it's only about 20% who are poor. So you have this concentration of poverty, which is really detrimental to everybody.
Wow.
So thinking about these, the influence of history and contemporary and current racist systems and policies, and those being more clear from our discussion, what are some potential solutions?
Well, I like to go back to this just again. I hit this point about what I view as this urban sharecropping. I mean, I think it's a crazy term of people, but and most white people are completely oblivious to it. I mean, the piece they did in the New York Times that the hair business is completely dominated by Koreans. I mean, they dominate the market entirely. In fact, Black people in the business, the wholesalers won't sell to them. This should be a legal piece. I don't know how they get away with this, but the wholesalers won't sell to them. So here you have a product, the consumers is Black and its product's Black, but the owners aren't. So I mean, I think I just picked out this is for just the hair products, but and again, I guess I'm thinking more locally all the time. What can we do? We don't have the means. I don't think myself, having such influence to influence national policy, but it would seem to me if we took a greater effort to support Black businesses in Black and brown businesses in those communities. It also has a psychological component. I talked about it someplace too, in terms of what Black businesses, that's kind of That's kind of interesting. Anybody who's had a business sort of knows that. It's incomprehensible to whites or anybody other group really that you would not buy from your own people, but that's another discussion. That's in part of it. I would like to see us to do better with, local businesses in the community. I mean, it'd be great if we can, had some federal monies, but so I wrote this the other day that whites are now asking us things like, what can I do? How can I help? What should be going on? And my answer to them is that you can help Black women, in this case, start Black businesses that on the local level. I don't know exactly how, we do that. I hear all these things, better business bureaus, I saw that Blacks had very little of the money that came, the PPP money. I don't know exactly what we'd have to do, but I'd like to see a focus on a more local level. And I also mentioned once before someplace that reparations, maybe I could say this, but I like to say something about reparations. I like to know what Mark might think about reparations. So I'll be quiet and see what you guys come up with.
Well, I think, actually, my perspective is in terms of dealing with the racial divide, in terms of dealing with poverty, the solutions, I think, we know a lot about that. The problem is we don't have the political will to implement those solutions. And that's the question that I think social work as a profession really needs to focus on is how do we engage and get the political will? And one of the arguments I make in terms of just poverty is that just from an economic point of view, childhood poverty in the United States costs us an enormous amount on an annual basis. So I did a study with a graduate student here a couple of years ago, and we showed that on an annual basis, poverty was costing us at least $1 trillion a year. To put that in perspective, that was about 30% of the entire federal budget. And the reason is childhood poverty leads to greater health problems. It leads to less economic productivity. It leads to higher incarceration and criminal justice costs. Those are enormous. And what we're winding up doing is paying on the back end of the problem instead of the front end of the problem. And we ought to be dealing with these issues, now to address them so that we don't have these problems down the road. So I think, we can talk a lot about, the ideas that are out there, but it's do we have the will to do it? And, maybe, Larry, what you're saying is, what you were talking about before we started is this is a window of opportunity. There is more, I think, because of Black Lives Matter, and there's more awareness of these issues. And this might be a time to really try to get something through.
Yeah, I'll just add on to these great comments by returning to something we talked about earlier, which is equitable access to housing and education as well. But I'll just deal with housing for a second. Thinking about policy change that is needed at both the federal level and the state and local level. Policymakers should seek to understand local residents' access to credit and survey down payment assistance programs, taking inventory of the developers and rehabilitators that are working on affordable construction and renovation locally is key to understanding housing supply, affordability, home ownership attainment. State and local policymakers should create deep dive demographic profiles with a racial equity lens for each city and region. This insight could help local policymakers, businesses, service providers more concretely address community needs and identify gaps and barriers to home ownership. So I think that those are some key policy levers that we could pull to ensure that one of the more basic ways in which wealth is accumulated, that Black and brown communities, those who are marginalized, can have greater access to it, which is through home ownership.
One of the things I like to respond to that, as well as to comment that Mark made, one of the most depressing realizations that I came to, and we're talking about this, is that, again, the term intentionality. that you're right, Mark. There is $1 trillion lost. But at some point now, I tell people that when you start out thinking about a problem, you should also ask yourself, who benefits from the existing order? See, people, we were naive. We were naive. We just thought, well, if we change this, yeah, who benefits from it being as it is? There are people, a little talk I gave somewhere, it sort of said that, that working on to do this would be good. I say this about universities, but there are people who are against those changes. I mean, people who own those construction companies sort of say, well, I can't hire anybody. I can't find anybody. And the university says, well, okay. But we have to think the same thing with these policies, that we might not who benefits from this, but somebody does. This is in somebody's interest to sustain this. If they viewed it not in their interest, it would change it. We have to assume they would change. I mean, you have to assume that they're not ignorant. I used to think completely naively about that, thinking, well, they just change this to be okay. But why should I want to open a housing market open if I can keep you crammed? I got that from I read from you, Mark, from the Pink and Blues, working someplace. If I can corral one population up into a very tight spot and reduce the amount of money they make per labor, why should I change that? This is also why people sort of say, blacks, minorities want to talk to whites about the situation. Why do they want to talk about it? They've got all the seats at the table. What's to talk about? I don't want to give up any of these seats. And this is something that's really, it's pessimistic. And I don't like this reality. I tell people all the time, it just is. But people have serious investments and benefits from the existing order.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is exactly spot on. And yeah, it's really, it's a question I've been thinking about a lot, is like, who benefits from this? And I've got some work coming out that's looking at the myths of poverty. And I asked the question, who benefits from these myths? And we can say, well, there are a number of people who benefit. For example, political actors, folks like Trump, down the line, Reagan, have used the issue, for example, of welfare as a code for race.
Yep.
And have used that to gather support for their message. And so I think that's really a fundamental question, is who's benefiting from poverty? Who's benefiting from these racial disparities? And what can we do about changing that mindset? So that's fundamental, yeah.
The question is, though, gentlemen, if it's as fundamental and, basic as we all suggest and know, is it impenetrable, right? Like, that is the, prevailing concern, right? That we are constantly fighting against. But how do you empower students, the next generation of social workers and scholars, to not feel daunted because it's so ingrained in the fabric of our society with great intention, as Dr. Davis has shared with us, right? I think that's our quest. Like, how do we empower the next generation of social workers, scholars, to not be daunted in this quest to fight against, something that's so common, right? Something that's so ingrained. One last thing I'll say is, I know we got to get to a period of questions and comments, but I was reading the piece that Daryl Hudson from WashU was quoted in the Washington Post article, talking about George Floyd's life and looking at it from different lenses. And one of the things that struck me was when Daryl talked about cortisol levels and how everyday discrimination and racism affects the Black bodies in detrimental ways. And what I thought about it was this very provocative thought, but what if racism and discrimination affected everyone like that? irrespective of your color, right, or your ethnicity? What if white people were just as sick and, you know, physiologically worn down over time because of racism and discrimination? What would our society look like? How would it be different?
It would revolt.
Say it again?
It would revolt, just as it would revolt. I mean, it would be a revolution. Typically, they talk about that figure being at something like, I don't know, 29% of the people who are doing very poorly begin to get to roots for revolution. It reminds me very much of John Kenneth Galbraith's comment, which is not very nice either. But it says, you know, something to the effect that the wealthy will risk their complete destruction rather than give up any of their advantage. So this is a real, you know, that's Galbraith. That's a real nice quote. I use that, always depresses groups, I'm sure. But that's kind of, you know, that's kind of how it is. So somehow it has to be, somehow we have to make the existing order no longer in their interest.
Wow.
Yeah, so I would say absolutely. And, you know, that's the whole notion of enlightened self-interest, that you realize that helping somebody else actually helps me. And that's sort of this idea of, you know, if we think about the racial divide, if we think about poverty, it actually is costing all of us. We're not as a productive society as we could be. We're wasting our human capital. So, and Michael, your point, I think is a really good one about, well, you know, it's easy to get depressed that we can't do anything about this. But I would say, and I don't want to be pie in the sky, but yes, there are powerful self-interest groups that it's to their advantage. But there are a lot of other people. We should vote. We need to organize. You know, that's what social workers should be really good at, is organizing around issues. And so, you know, we may not have the money, but I think we eventually have the numbers to do something about it.
Yeah, Mark, you know, I think that should make sense. There's a book called Poison. I forgot now who wrote it recently. It's a recent book that came out. But it talks about how America has historically, with regards to Blacks, operated against its own self-interest.
Yes.
I mean, the South is still doing that.
Wow.
The Affordable Care Act, right?
Right.
You know, and I have this expression, they almost have decided that it's better for a white man to go hungry than a Black man to be fed.
Yeah.
That they're willing to take the hit. Rather than bringing in the Affordable Care Act, that was the same thing you mentioned earlier about Social Security. You know, the only reason they agreed to that, 80%, as you mentioned, figure, but 80% of the workers were farmers or domestics, so Blacks were out of it. So they've been unwilling. I mean, they've been. I think that one of the worst things is to be a white person in the country who's poor, in part because the system is unwilling to help you either, because it might help Black people.
Yeah.
And the history is full of it, where they'll cast whites to the wind if it means helping Black people.
Yeah, there was a quote from Lyndon Johnson, I think in 1960, where he says, he's talking to an aide, and he says, "I'll tell you what's at the bottom of this. If you can convince the poorest white man that he's better than the colored man, he'll empty his pockets for you."
That's right.
And it's exactly what you're saying.
So somehow we have to, this is, I'm not advocating violence here, but one of the things that I've always felt for example, this kid who was shot a couple of people, right? He came to protect some property. He wasn't there to protect Black property. He was there to protect other people's property. It's they're not concerned. Most of the things that that get burned up, people say, "Oh, they burn up the community." Yeah, some of them are Black owned, but by and large, Black people don't own the Black community. And if they did, in fact, that's an argument for them having more investment. At one time, the last figure I checked on that, 35% of African Americans had zero or negative net worth. Negative net worth. That means they had no tangible investment in society.
Mm.
What have I got to lose? So people say, oh, they're buried up. Yeah, they didn't. Unfortunately, you get some people mixed in there who do all kinds of hoodlums and stuff. But by and large, so it's cities that have their bond ratings reduced. For example, this didn't help WashU when Ferguson, right? It hurt the enrollments. It hurt the it really had negative implications for the university, for the city. Who wants to live in the city and they got riots all the time? So these things. So that's the real. I don't know if that's really what comes about with this protest, but I always felt that if it hadn't had that, I'm not sure King's message alone would have done it. Yeah. It's terrible as that sounds.
This has been an eye-opening discussion about solutions and just the amount of work that needs to be done to address this at a very systemic level. I appreciate all the discussion we've had so far, and it's generated a lot of questions from our audience. And there's a couple that I'd like to field out to our illustrious panel here, if I might. The first one is related to what we were just talking about. So how can we promote Black business ownership and entrepreneurship? That seems like a critical piece of solution that was discussed, both as contributing to inequity in major ways, but also as an opportunity for addressing that inequity.
I don't know. I mean, I think my sort of quick response would be that we have to have intentionality and a plan for the, initial support and longevity of Black businesses. One of the important things about Black banks, for example, is that for commercial loans, as Mirza Baradaman, shares in her book, that was the go-to place. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau and the bank that was associated with it held the promise of land acquisition, right? Through, savings and lending. And so I think that with great intention, we have to, really support Black banks. But we know historically that whenever there's been a bailout plan, Black banks have not been the beneficiary of, that bailout.
I have thought about this too. It doesn't address quite what you're talking about, but if I could promote something and had to, it's possible. Part of what we have to do is recognize we do have resistance, and that I think we need to propose solutions which don't raise such a high resistance from whites in candor. And one of the things I think that we have sort of a blueprint for it a little bit. Like we had Shaun and I talked about a Marshall Plan. But I wouldn't call this is a conversation about reparations. I probably wouldn't call them reparations, only because many whites would dig in their heels and say, we're not giving them anything. But you might do the Harlem Children's Zone in all the major poverty places in the country. So you would have one in Appalachia or two or whatever you need to have that cover that white population, that make it a more comprehensive, because you pick up there's a lot of poor white people running around too. You pick up those if you had, and the thing I liked about the Harlem Children's Zone, it addressed the educational issue, what we were talking about. And even though Blacks sometimes receive less for their education they put in, it is really one of the keys out of poverty and for just a better life. So if I could speak to the president, hopefully, and say, what would you recommend to do? I'd like to start, and not me, but have him start a Harlem Children's Zone in all the major poverty clusters in the country, not just reparations for Blacks. Anyway, that's it. I just like it for all kinds of, it educates people. And so.
Fantastic. And that zone has worked so well in Harlem, could work very well in so many cities. Why is it just sitting in one place when it could benefit so many people.
It's got a track record. I mean, it has been successful.
As an evidence base.
Yeah, that's right.
That's so true. To close out, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and this was a great, I think, closing question for us to consider. So, leadership doesn't always come from the top. In fact, a lot of changes come from the ground. What can each of us do to help dismantle systemic racism in our everyday lives? All of us have to be part of this solution, I think.
Come on, my colleagues, you guys know all these answers. Come
Well,
on.
I always think about this question, which is, when we write things and talk about things, it's like, yeah, but what can one person do? What can I do to address this? And I kind of go back to, it begins with discussions. It begins with talking to your family, your friends, your peers, talking about these issues and making these arguments. And that to me is, I guess, where it starts, and then kind of going from there and trying to build on that. But I think that's where at least ideas begin, is exchanges and talking to people and going over these things that we're talking about here today.
I'm reminded of in Randall Robinson's book, The Debt. He talks about a conversation that he had with Maynard Jackson some years ago about this notion of
Former mayor of Atlanta.
Yeah, the former mayor of Atlanta, Morehouse College graduate,
Morehouse, okay.
but he talked about this notion of Black Card, which is a 20-point plan that every Black person would have as in their wallets, purses, whatever, that would essentially suggest things that are important related to our, well-being, related to education, housing, financial security, whatever the case may be, that they would then refer to in local elections, national elections, and every elected or person seeking election would be judged on how many yeses were marked off based on this 20-point plan. And it's a way of sort of operating within the system, within the parameters. Yeah, that's a plan. That's, an idea. I don't know why this phone is ringing right now, but yeah, that's an idea.
It's an excellent idea, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. It's one I've not been aware of.
That's probably the president calling you, Mike.
It may well be.
Where would we be without some humor, right?
Right. Keep us all.
I want to say, I think, yeah, I think the conversation needs to be good. I think there's some things, though, if cities, I'm for the big picture, but also increasingly for using Booker T. Washington's adage about cast your buckets down where you are. And that was really the title of that piece that your dean was talking about. It was really called that, but I cut it out and something. But if in the cities, if we could get, more Black businesses funded, started, that's within our realm, and it doesn't really attack. It does, because some people are making money off of it. So a lot of people are in a hurry to have us become more entrepreneurial. But that's one of the things I think, wherever possible, in local elections or conversations, that we can support more local businesses. That's something that's good on grass, I think.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for Dr. Lindsey, Dean Davis, and Dr. Rank for this excellent discussion about a very important topic, systemic racism and poverty in America. We've covered the breadth and depth of the issue. its historical and contemporary contributors, and some possible solutions. I'll just add for everyone watching, something that you can do next Tuesday is vote, and that is something to do. And so with that, I'd like to thank our illustrious panel. I'd like to thank the American Academy of Social Work and Social Welfare, Washington University, and of course the University of Pittsburgh Center on Race and Social Problems for providing us this forum to have these conversations and to learn more about how we can make America achieve its proper place and equity in the world. Thank you.
Thank
For
you.
having me. Thanks, Shaun. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Larry.
Thank you all. It was so great to be with you.